Good day, everyone. My name is Arnel Madrazo. I'm a teacher blogger. If it's your first time to visit me in my channel, thank you for taking your time to view my videos. So for this particular video, I'm going to do a book review on a world masterpiece titled The Book of Job. So, well, this is intended for my students who are enrolled in Great Books, which is a literature class that would involve the analysis of world masterpieces. Allow me to start by giving you a brief background of the texts. Then I'll proceed by giving you the synopsis or the summary of the texts. Then I'll proceed by giving my interpretation to certain unusual patterns or utterances and even implications for discourses. So for this particular analysis, I would like to focus more on the characterization, and perhaps I'd like to delve in a bit on utterances of the characters, and as well implications, questions that would lead us to ponder about life, about our faith in God. So let me start by giving you the brief review of the text. So this is a dramatic point. Of course, this is titled according to the protagonist, Job, and that this is considered as a world masterpiece for its artistic pattern and sophisticated style. That's according to the New American Bible 1995. So this is my main source or my main reference that I used as my text of analysis. So this is the New American Bible 1995. And so the author is unknown, and it was believed to be written in the 7th and 5th century BC, and it is didactic in its intent. So the text is basically aimed to teach, to impart the teachings about faith, about belief in God. So the visions of the book of Job are the following. So it starts with a prologue, and then followed by the first cycle of speeches, then second cycle of speeches, third cycle of speeches, and then Job's final summary of his cause, and then followed by Elihu's speech, and then of course the Lord's or God's speech, and then it ended with the epilogue. Now, let me now proceed to the summary of the text. So the story tells about a righteous man, blameless and upright, as was described in this text. He is really a religious man. He offers sacrifices to God, and he obeys God religiously or very consistently. And that he is really a wealthy man, blessed with a lot of properties, blessed with loving family. Okay, so one day, Satan, in his conversation with God, somehow doubts Job's faith in God. And so Job challenged God to put Job to the test in terms of faith by proposing that God should allow him to strip off everything, his wealth, his family, and even his health. And so that's the proposition of Satan in order to test really if Job would really have that 100% faith in God. Because accordingly, perhaps Job only loves you because he is being blessed with wealth, with good family, and with good health. What about if you remove this blessings, this good family and his good health in him, away from him? So will Job still be faithful to God? So that's the contention of Satan. And so God agreed, and God allowed that these things, wealth, his family, and his health, be stripped off from him, from Job. And so in just one snap of a finger, just like that, everything in just one day, everything was stripped off from him. Everything was removed wealth, his family, uh, his family met an accident, and all of the members of his family died. And then the last tragedy was he contracted this disease, and so he became very ill and he became very sick. And so that is where uh, the tragedy ended. And so with that, uh, his friends visited him and started comforting him. So the friends were known as comforters in the text. And so these friends were really trying to comfort him and trying to help him figure out what really was the problem. What happened? Why was he experiencing this tragedy? So for his friends, they were they were telling him that maybe you have done something in the past, perhaps unknowingly, a sin that you committed that is the cause of all these tragedies. And so Job disagreed that, even if he was experiencing all this, he would still try to remain righteous, by saying that he did not commit any sins, he did not commit any wrongdoings, and that he refused to agree with them as to the sins that he might have committed. He really still maintains that he's blameless and he's righteous, and that he does not deserve all these sufferings that he's experiencing. And so he demanded the presence of God. He demanded a reply. But then there's this young man, Elihu, who also delivered this speech, and then made him realize somehow God's omniscience and power. Elihu reminded him of God's omniscience, meaning all-knowing. He's all-knowing. He knows everything from the start till the end of man's life. And that it is necessary for us to seek God in everything, even in suffering. Because only God knows what will happen to us. He's being omniscient and as well very powerful. And that we need to be reminded that we need to trust Him. And so, but then somehow he was enlightened, but still he demanded the reply of God. So he was waiting for the reply of God to all these questions. In fact, in the text, it does not necessarily show in his face that he was really denouncing God. Still, he was just asking for answer to all these sufferings that he committed. And so God replied not on the basis of justifying his decisions to Job or to men, but he replied on the basis of his omniscience and power, and reminded him that Job's limited, finite mind cannot understand God's omniscience and power. And I think this is true to us. No? Sometimes we do question Him, but our finite mind cannot understand what God is. His being omniscient and powerful. We cannot comprehend. I think that's the point. God's infinite love and faith to us. Or we cannot comprehend God's omniscience and power. That only Him, in fact, knows what will happen to us in the future. And so with this, after God reminded him of who God is, of the one who is all-knowing and all-powerful, reminded him that He alone can give him peace, can bless him, and that it's necessary that it is not by one's own righteousness, but it is by God's grace that he will be saved that he is in fact will will prosper, will be blessed. It's God's grace, not by his own righteousness. Okay, so let us now proceed to my comments. Now, I would like to focus more on questions. I'd like to start with questions here because this is raising a fundamental uh, issue about why a righteous man deserve this kind of suffering. Okay, so I think the first question that we need to ask in the text is that on the thought of God's allowing a righteous man to suffer. So why punish the good and prosper the bad? Right? Sometimes we do ask that question. That sometimes we see people who are doing bad things yet they prosper, and then here comes a good person. We know that it's righteous, following God's will. Sometimes they're being punished. No? It's as if they're being punished for the sufferings that they're facing. And so, it's important that we need to be clear with the conversation here, the speeches delivered by the characters here. But I think what is really very important would be, I think it would be, things will make sense here if we will look at what God is telling Job. That his finite, limited mind cannot process or comprehend yet what is in store for him in the future. Because only God knows what will happen to him. And so, for anything that we are experiencing, sufferings, death, sicknesses that we have, viruses, no? All these things will only make sense if we will turn to God, if we will turn to Him and then consult Him as to what will happen to us, because only Him who has the omniscience and power. So if there would be suffering always, we do not rely on our own strength. We do not rely on our own strength and on our own righteousness. See, that's, I think, where the dilemma lies in the case of Job. Because if you see Job, he was a righteous man. And it's very difficult for him to process what was happening because he was really very righteous. And it is according to his works, no? That he was looking at it from the standpoint of being a righteous man, his own works, and perhaps not anymore on the basis of God's grace, but it's according to his own righteousness, because it is him, it was Job, accordingly, the way he looks at it, it's according to his own works that he is being blessed by God. See, that is where I think the dilemma would lie when you're focusing much on your own works, that it is by your own works that you're righteous and therefore you are being blessed. Well, true enough, he was blessed with wealth, with family, good health. But then when trials came, again, he questioned because he was really focused more on his own works and not perhaps by God's grace. No? He was more into his own righteousness, questioning, what have I done wrong? So, and not anymore focusing on the omniscience and power of God. That maybe through all this, there would be a purpose. And that, true enough, after all these trials, after all the dilemma, after the speech of God, he was blessed again 100-fold. See, after all the storms, after all the trials, he was still blessed with a new family, a loving family. His properties were reverted back to him 100-fold, and even his health. He lived many years with his family, enjoying as well his properties that God blessed him. But then he couldn't understand that yet when he was suffering. So perhaps that is also a question to us, no? Whether we can comprehend God's omniscience and power and purpose in the midst of suffering. especially now that it's pandemic. Perhaps we are experiencing financial problems, financial difficulties. Are we still seeing God's work, God's grace amid suffering, just like Job? Okay, now let us proceed in the comparison. So let me compare certain characters, no, in the text. No? So accordingly, there is this there's this video that I watched. No? It's a inspiring philosophy video that would uh, attempt to interpret certain lines in the text that would make sense. No? For example, it was stated by inspiring uh, philosophy 2014 that Jesus, in the case of, in terms of the reaction after the suffering. So normally, if we read the texts, in the case of Jesus during his time of suffering in the cross, remember he shouted, he cried out to God, crying out to God, Lord, why have you abandoned me? So it's a normal reaction for a man, for a human being, to cry out to God, to cry out and ask for help, no? That I'm helpless. So it's a reaction that when you cry out to God, shout out to God, cry out, it's a normal emotion. Showing your weaknesses, no? Showing your weaknesses is really normal. Same thing with King Hezekiah. So King Hezekiah also, in times of suffering, cried out to God. Cried out to God. Same thing with Jeremiah. In times of sufferings and lamentations, he was crying out to God, expressing his deep emotions, no? Crying out to God, just like Jesus. Same thing for me, and even for you. Whenever you are experiencing problems, no, or sufferings in life, it's a normal reaction that we cry. Sometimes we even become angry. We express our disappointment of God. Why me? Right? So that's really the question that we ask. So why me, Lord? So why me? And so, if we were to compare our reactions, no? For example, Jesus, Hezekiah, Jeremiah, and even us, crying out to God. No? So, do we have the same reaction as Job? In fact, Job was not, or did not really have that same reaction. For him, he would still utter, "Blessed be the name, blessed be the name of God." So still, you can see there that on that reaction, if you read the text, that line, everything was gone, he would still say, "Blessed be the name of God." So that reaction would still tell us that perhaps Job was still trying to keep that righteousness, no, righteous act, that he wouldn't really show his weaknesses to God. So, naked have I come. No? Naked have I come. You created me naked, and naked will I return to you. So he tore down his clothes. No? And then he would say, "Blessed be the name of God." That was his reaction. It seems like it's not really a common reaction to human beings, even amongst ourselves, whenever we are experiencing suffering. By really showing to God our emotions, our weaknesses, that we question God. Sometimes we express our disappointments. Why me? Why are you giving me this trial? So we're showing our weaknesses, but it seems like Job is not showing God his weaknesses, because he would still want to show God that he was a righteous man. Right? Even if in his tone, eventually, he was already questioning God as to why God was punishing a righteous man. So, do you see the point? In this text, it seems like Job was really basing his relationship with God on the basis of his own good works. On the basis of being righteous. That being righteous, in fact, will delight God, no? Will please God with his righteousness. In fact, when he was already suffering, he wouldn't want to really show his anger. No? He wouldn't want to show his weaknesses. But then, God is putting him to the test. Do you love me because of your works? Do you love me because you're righteous? In that, in being righteous, you're expecting me to bless you. That's a very point. No? Sometimes the the some would some would try to go to church and do good deeds because they're expecting something in return from God. Sometimes when their prayers are not answered, sometimes it's they are they bear this resentment because God is not blessing them. But sometimes, God is telling us that even without me answering your prayers yet, even if you're poor, even if you do not have food to eat, I am still here with you. I will still provide for you. See, Job's idea of pleasing God is for him to do to be righteous so that he will be blessed by God. And that if you're a righteous man, you will be blessed. If you're a bad person, you will be punished. And so that's a dilemma for him because since he was righteous, why was he punished? That's really his question to God. And so, but the point here is that God, even if you are a sinner, right? In the parable of the prodigal son, even if you are a sinner, I still love you because you are my child. Even if you committed a mistake, I am still going to show you my mercy. So see, that's the point, no? From Old Testament, the law of retribution, if you do good, blessed, but if you do bad, you will be punished in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, God's image is more of showing mercy. And so we cannot really question God as to who He blesses and as to who He is testing. It is not for us to question because we cannot, as I said, in our limited, finite mind, we do not even understand yet His omniscience, His purpose, His omniscience and power and purpose for us. So God wants us to be His children. He would want to establish good relationship to us. He wants to walk with us. But in this case, it seems like Job wouldn't really want to take time to walk with God and tell God, express himself, his weaknesses, his frustrations. No? And yet, he was arguing with God as to why punish me when in fact I'm a righteous man. I did not commit any mistakes. I did not commit any errors. But in fact, he was already committing something that is not pleasing to God. And that is by relying so much on your own righteousness, relying so much on your own works. Because that will, what's the very dilemma of Job here was pride. The pride led him to really feel that he was not doing wrong, that he was not committing sin. But in fact, pride on one's works, taking pride that you are righteous in, is something that is misleading and that will lead you to commit a sin, which is pride. Because the focus is supposed to be God's grace, not your own righteousness. You're righteous because of God's grace. God blessed you with intellect. God blessed you with everything. So always focus on God. So never question God's decision. Because only God knows the first and the last. He is the first and the last. In fact, He is omniscient and He is omnipotent. The most knowledgeable and the most powerful. In fact, He is omniscient and omnipotent God. So that's His nature. And who are we to question His omniscience and power? Okay, so in terms of prediction, when I first read this, when I first read Book of Job, perhaps I was reading the part where he was slowly losing his properties, and when his family and loved ones were slowly taken away from him, it's like it was painful on my part. In fact, I didn't finish reading Book of Jobs at first. I stopped reading because I cannot just process all the sufferings that he was experiencing. Because I thought that I was already predicting where this is heading. That he will live a very lonely life, no? That eventually he will die a very lonely individual without anyone. And I was already predicting after what happened to him, then the friends were already giving him some consolations, no? Were trying to help him figure out. I think that was the part where the friends were telling him that you did something wrong. I cannot, the way Job was thinking was also my thinking. It's like I cannot process uh, why does a righteous man deserve to suffer. So my prediction at first was he will be living a lonely life, then he will die of that sickness without having to hear from God what happened. That was my prediction. But again, since this is just a prediction, we can be wrong. Whenever we read the text, sometimes we get the prediction correct, but sometimes we may not be correct. So my first prediction was I had the feeling that he will die a lonely man with a sickness without anyone beside him. The I mean the loved ones, because all the loved ones passed away. And that I stopped reading. I stopped reading this because of the intensity of the tragedies that occurred to him. It was just very difficult for me to process at that time. But then I was forced to read this because I was a literature teacher. And I really need to process this text in order that I'm able to say something worthwhile for my students in class. And so, basically, I think that is where the theme is leading. The theme is basically telling us that even a righteous man will experience suffering. So it doesn't mean that you're a good person, you're immune to suffering. There is a proclivity for all of us to experience suffering. Uh, so we do not question God because God knows you, because He created you. He created us. So we cannot blame God because for everything and anything that would happen to us, we just have to look up and pray to God. Whatever happens, tragedy, sufferings, we still need to look up to God and rely on God whatever happens, because He has the answer to all our problems. So what's the solution? What's the answer to the problem? Turn to God by making an effort to be aware. Be aware of what God's word for us is. So we really have to know God through His words. We have to know God by having fellowship with His children. Seek God. Seek God and know God by His words. So we cannot just rely on our own strength and on our own righteousness. We have to seek God in the scripture, and we need to seek God in other people. So by making ourselves aware of God's omniscience and power, whatever happens, even if it's pandemic, even if you lost your job, even if you are sick, still there's God. If you are not blessed here on earth, maybe we will be blessed in life eternal. Okay, so I hope that you learned something from this book review. Just please continue to join me in this channel. So please again, do not forget to like, subscribe, and comment, and even share this video. I'm always trying to share something that is worthwhile to my students. And if you are now listening to this part, so thank you for viewing the vlogs from the start till the end, so that you will experience the richness of the review. And again, thank you for supporting me. And I still intend to continue on making more book reviews in order that you will not only be entertained, but you will be able to learn something that is worthwhile to process. And on my part, I always advocate the value for reading. So happy reading and writing to one. Bye. See you later.